Hi, my name is Amy Nichols-Belo, and welcome to the second part of Demystifying the IRB. So this segment really focuses on case studies for the teacher scholar. And so what I'm not doing in this section is talking about what the IRB is and why you should care. If you want to know about that, you can go to the first segment. And I'm not really talking about the process so much in this segment. Instead, I'm talking about, I'm presenting case studies from my own experiences as a teacher scholar at Mercer University, and also several hypothetical case studies. Again, this segment is not Office of Research Compliance, the ORC. Instead, I am just offering case studies for you to think through the kinds of projects that you're doing with your students, particularly ones that involve research that reaches out. So here I've given you two scenarios. The second scenario is from one of my actual classes, but I want to talk through each one. So many people will tell you that if a class project does not need IRB approval. And that's true, but there's a kind of subtlety to it. So is it a class project that is only going to be used within the class? That to me is kind of the litmus test here. So for example, in example number 2, I teach a medical anthropology course, typically once a year. And in that class, I have my students carry out mini ethnographic projects. So ethnography is a method that might involve interviewing. It often involves observation. And so I have students develop a project proposal and then carry out interviews and observations. So here's an example of a specific project that a student carried out. She was a student athlete and was interested in looking at complementary and alternative medicine used by the athletics department. So she wanted to talk to athletic trainers and also students that had experienced CAM, things like cupping or massage therapy or acupuncture. So she did a literature review on alternative medicine and sports medicine, and then she carried out interviews. Even though she was not, we weren't going to get IRB approval because it was just a class project, nobody was going to read it besides me, I still had her learn about consent forms, and I had her get informed consent from her participants. But there was no sort of final presentation to the class. There was no final presentation outside of the class. And so in that particular case, it met the it's just a class project standard. Only I read the papers and no one else did. And there was no identifiable information in the papers. Okay, here's where we get into a little bit of a gray area with example number 1. And this is a hypothetical example. But since so many of us at Mercer do engage research as part of our service learning, this might give you an example of something where you might want to consider submitting it to the IRB. So in this case, an instructor is teaching an INT 201 course that includes a service learning component at a Bibb County school. Perhaps the students are tutoring. So in addition to tutoring, the students are conducting interviews with teachers and parents about the benefits of the tutoring program. And again, this isn't the students coming up with this project on their own. In this scenario, the instructor is having the students do these interviews and then analyze them, and then at the end of the semester, the report is going to be submitted to the Bibb County Board of Education. Some people would say, well, this isn't research. This is a program review or something like that. In my case, I would say that this program should receive IRB approval, and the students should receive training in ethical guidelines about human subjects. So it's not entirely in-house. Let's imagine this is taking place at Alexander II. This isn't just information for Alexander II. This information is being analyzed and interpreted and submitted to the Bibb County Board of Education. So even though it's quote unquote just a class project, from my perspective, this one meets the test of going beyond just the instructor and no one else and going to a larger audience. The other thing is once that report's been submitted to the Bibb County Board of Education, we don't know what they're going to do with it. And so it would be better for everyone if the instructor had gotten IRB approval. And you might say, well, that sounds like a lot of work, but the IRB process at Mercer is very, very functional. It works quite quickly. And so in this case, the instructor would have wanted to submit the IRB protocol before the beginning of the semester to make sure that the data collected by the students could be used. So adding on to that, often at Mercer, we do all sorts of things for the community. And often those projects are led by the community, or sometimes they're generated by students or faculty. And so I'm giving you two examples. Again, number 4 is from my own experiences as a teacher scholar at Mercer, but I'm gonna start with number 3. So a student is doing an internship at an international nonprofit. So this student is working outside the United States, and she is, at the request of the nonprofit, she's gonna carry out an evaluation of their work. So she's going to survey constituents at the nonprofit, and she is going to do a kind of coding, perhaps, of the nonprofit's work. And because it's she hasn't gotten IRB approval, she hasn't even thought about it, because she's thinking about this as something generated by the nonprofit. Again, in this example, it's an international nonprofit. It could just as easily be happening here in Macon. So in this case, her instructor back home has an internship journal that she's reading. The student's been keeping regular entries of her work. And the instructor says, this sounds like an excellent project. You should absolutely present this at Bear Day, either as a research talk or a poster. Can she? So here's where I think that it's, again, important for us as teacher scholars to understand what's gone on. So in this case, the student has interviewed maybe people who have received services from the nonprofit. Perhaps she's done surveys with the staff. And so what she's done is she's essentially collected human subjects data. When it stayed with the nonprofit and was part of the nonprofit's work, it might not have met the standard for research. But once she's presenting at Bear Day, according to that kind of double test, is she collecting data for research purposes, and is she presenting it in a generalizable research setting like Bear Day, she needs to get IRB approval. Now, does this mean that the student is out of luck and that she can't present her findings at Bear Day? No, what she could do in this case is apply for retrospective IRB approval. She would first want to check with her supervisor at the nonprofit to see if they were willing to let her present her findings. The nonprofit might want to have their name obscured, have her use a pseudonym. They may not feel comfortable. So that would be the first step if I were advising the student, would be to write the nonprofit, assuming she's home, or if she's still there, to talk to them in person and say, may I present the findings of my work at a conference or at our local research program like Bear Day? If the nonprofit organization supervisor was amenable, then she would want to go through the process of applying for retrospective IRB. And that's going to be a little bit of a challenging process, but it's not out of the question, and it would allow the student's work to then be able to be shared at Bear Day or some other setting. In example number 4, this is a real life example from the spring of 2020. Unfortunately, we were unable to finish our project because of the COVID-19 crisis. But I was teaching a qualitative methods course this semester. And instead of having my students do sort of mock projects of the kind maybe that I described in the last slide, I decided that as a class, we would carry out a research project based at Daybreak. So we were interested, Daybreak had asked for somebody to help figure out the health needs of individuals who use Daybreak, which is a day shelter for the homeless here in Macon, Georgia. And they were really interested in how their own clinic was sort of meeting needs or maybe not meeting needs. So I was approached about this project from somebody connected with Daybreak. And I decided to use my research methods course as a place to actually do the data collection. So I didn't, of course, have the individual students write IRBs, though that is possible depending on what project you're doing. Instead, I wrote an IRB and I had students help me develop the research instruments, the interview and focus group guides, as well as a short survey. So we wrote all of those instruments together, and about a third of the way through the semester, we submitted the IRB with those research addenda. Okay, so even though Daybreak would be the final recipient of the report, in this particular case, my hope before we had to terminate the project was to actually write an academic paper that used the data as well. So in this case, it was going to be both a project for Daybreak and for external use. So when I wrote the IRB, I included the students as research assistants, but I was the PI on the project. Okay, so now we're getting into scholarship of teaching and learning. And this is really important because a lot of times we engage in pedagogical innovation, but we're not really sure what the best practices are on publishing. And generally in scholarship of teaching and learning, and this is not a segment about that particularly, there are other folks working on segments about that, but there are, sometimes you just write up a method, and sometimes you want to demonstrate that a certain pedagogical method is superior to the standard practice. And so that really gets into what is much more like interventional research. So in example number 5, an instructor is teaching 2 sections of the same finance class in the fall. They want to experiment with a new pedagogy, but not in one section, but not the other. So this is a really good example of interventional research. The section that's getting the normal method is functioning like a control group, and the section that's getting the experimental method, the new method, is functioning like an experimental group. So this is a kind of classic human subjects experiment. One group of students is going to get the new treatment, the new method, and the other group of students is going to get the regular standard way of teaching the finance class, right? So this instructor wants to know which is better and is planning to collect data from the students and compare the sections. So a colleague says, this sounds like a great scholarship of teaching and learning project. You should absolutely write it up and publish it. This instructor might not have been thinking about it, but this instructor needs human subjects approval. They need to go through the IRB because the students in this case are human subjects. They may need to get, the instructor may need to get consent from the students to participate and allow students to opt out from having their data used. The instructor will need to justify why some students are getting the treatment and others are not. In this case, it's not randomized, right? Depends which section the students signed up for. But the important thing is to understand that you can't just sort of write up your really cool pedagogical experiment without referring to ethical procedures. Again, if you watch the first segment of this series, students and employees are considered to be people that need a special protection. Just because they're students that signed up for your class doesn't mean that they volunteered to be subjects for your research project. Number 6 is another example of one of my projects. And in this particular case, I had my very first semester at Mercer for my intro class for GHS 200. I did a research paper with limited success. It was an intro class, students weren't really ready to write good research papers. So I created a WHO simulation. It's basically a mock World Health Assembly. And it was really successful. And I realized it was a really, great way for students to kind of demonstrate what they learned in the course of the semester. And then a bit later, I came into contact with a list of competencies for global health. And I thought, wow, I'd really like to analyze my simulation data to see if it, the things that students produce, to see if it demonstrates these core competencies. Was it too late for me? So in that case, what I did was I wrote an IRB protocol that asked for retrospective analysis of past students that had taken the course in previous semesters. And then I added a consent document to a final evaluation for that project and asked students if they would be willing to participate. Only one student opted out, and the IRB approved that. In other words, they said it was okay for me going forward to collect data because I was giving students permission, and because I had not done anything that was putting undue burden on students, I was looking at de-identified information that they had produced and recoding it, that was acceptable. At the same time, I also asked if I could have data from the Office of Institutional Effectiveness, from the OIE, to see what majors, for example, students had, so I could do some matching data. So that's another example of retrospective IRB approval, where I didn't realize I was really doing anything pedagogically innovative at the time, but then I realized I wanted to write it up. Still haven't gotten around to writing it up, but when I get to do it, I'll be able to explain that I have gotten human subjects review. And not only is that important for the reasons I've talked about in the other segments, but most journal articles that are publishing scholarship of teaching and learning want to know that you've gotten human subjects approval, and that you aren't just, experimenting on your students or using student data without having gone through IRB. Here is another sort of related category. I didn't think I was doing research, but maybe it is. So often when we do things like Mercer on Mission programs, we realize in the field that our programs are really successful and we want to write them up. So in this hypothetical example, these two engineering faculty members decide that they want to write about the success of their programs, but it's already happened. So again, they would want to think about what they're writing about. Are they writing about the program, or are they writing about human subjects within the program, or human subjects who receive the program? So they want to first check that human subjects requirement. And if they indeed want to write about, they want to, for example, use data collected from people who were participants in their program, both students, other faculty, or individual recipients of the intervention, then they can apply for retrospective review. Again, it's a little bit like that example of the student who's doing the internship. You would want to consult with your in-country partners. You'd want to talk to the IRB, and again, you might be able to apply for retrospective review. If not, you could think about that first program as a pilot program, and then apply for IRB approval for your next iteration of the program. So again, it's another one of those examples of a lot of times we're doing things that we think of as service, or we think of as a pilot, or we think of as everyday work that may end up being research. And again, the standard is, are you planning on publishing the work? Are you planning on sharing it outside of the institution? So back to that student in number 2 who did the project on CAM. So that student is a junior, and this is a real student, and comes to me at the end of the semester and says, I really enjoyed this project. Can I do a senior research project next semester? And so in this particular case, the student says, I want to do this. So what I would recommend, and again, this is a little bit of a hypothetical mishmash of a couple of examples, is the student can complete a new IRB form, and we can either ask to include those previous interviews, or the student can think about that as a pilot and not include those interviews and then just do new ones going forward. Both are acceptable. In this particular case, because it's a student and I want to really make sure the student understands the whole ethical process, I would recommend that the previous work be kind of informative, but not actually be included in the data that ends up being in the senior research project. I would basically say, let's start from scratch, but use what you learned to help inform your new interview guide, your new survey, etc. So these are just a few of the scenarios that might help you to think about whether or not you need IRB approval. Again, our research as teacher scholars often starts as service and ends as research. And that's been especially the case since research that reaches out and service research became part of our guiding kind of work at Mercer. The other piece, of course, is mentoring students. And often students have really excellent ideas, but aren't sure how to navigate the contours of research and service. There are many, many other scenarios I could have come up with, but I think these are a few to get you started about thinking about how to navigate the IRB.